All right, so going back to the dura mater very quickly. Dura mater is just going to be that outermost layer. This is the layer that actually comes in contact with the bone. So if the dura mater is protecting or if we're in the brain, this is actually going to be in contact with the cranial bones. If it is the dura mater that is covering the spinal cord, now this is going to come in contact with the vertebral bones. So if you need to remember positioning, just keep in mind that the dura mater is always going to come in contact with the bone structures itself. Then you have the middle layer, which the middle layer is going to be responsible for, basically it gets its name arachnoid mater because it looks like a spider web. If you hold it up, it's going to have lots of holes and spaces and gaps in it. And so that is where the name arachnoid mater comes from. You guys hear arachnoid, most of you would think of spiders, and so since it looks like a spider web, that is the name that they gave it. Part of the arachnoid mater, this is going to make up the subdural space, and so the area that you have between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater is known as the subdural location. You also have the subarachnoid space, and this is going to be the area that is created when you have the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. We are talking about incredibly small spaces. When you talk about the cerebral spinal fluid, and that's what's going to fill this area, is the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid is responsible for bathing the brain and the spinal cord, as well as making sure it gets all the nutrients that it needs, as well as keeping those ion concentrations for nerve impulses to be able to work where they need to be. So cerebral spinal fluid has a very important job. But when we talk about the brain and the spinal cord needing this cerebral spinal fluid, you're only talking about 120 milliliters of fluid total. So when you put into context that a can of pop is going to be 355 milliliters, the fact that your brain and spinal cord is taken care of by only 120 milliliters, very small scale. So these spaces, these subdural spaces, subarachnoid spaces, we are talking about very small areas within the body. Cerebral spinal fluid itself is a clear fluid, usually a yellow color to it, but you can see through it. When you can't see through it and it becomes milky or cloudy in color, that is an indication that there is some sort of infection going on within the cerebral spinal fluid and within your nervous system. The third layer is the pia mater. Again, innermost layer that you have. This is actually going to come in contact with the brain or the spinal cord, depending on which part of the nervous system you're in. And it doesn't just lay over the top of the brain and the spinal cord, it actually will dive down into all the little folds and crevices and convolution grooves that you have. So it's very much adheres to the surface and takes on the shape of the brain and the spinal cord. It would be the equivalent of a person putting on spandex pants. Okay, so very close, very tight to the brain and the spinal cord, and it's going to, again, help deliver those nutrients, the cerebral spinal fluid, to the brain and the spinal cord, so you do want them to be in proximity with each other. All right, moving over to the next page, which gets into gray matter and white matter. We've already talked about gray matter and white matter, that the white matter is on the outside portion of the spinal cord and gray matter is going to be at the core. Now, you have some structures within the gray matter and white matter that are unique to those two locations. When we talk about white matter, we talk about a funiculus. And a funiculus, the best way that I can describe it is to think of elevators. They are tracks of nerves, and they will run information either up and be part of an ascending track, or they will run information down from the brain, and then they're called a descending track. But they are located in the white matter, and the white matter only. And the funiculus is going to, like I said, take information either up to the brain or bring it down from the brain, but they are very specific. They can only take information in one direction. So when you talk about a funiculus, you are talking about either taking information up or down, and so you do get the specific names of ascending or descending. Within the gray matter, you have what are called horns. And I'm sorry, I realize I just kind of made a jump on you guys. They did gray matter first, and I went to white matter, so hopefully you're not struggling too much to find the information. The ascending tracks and descending tracks is just on the top of the next page, so I apologize for jumping ahead. But within the gray matter, that is where you would find the horns. And when they name both the funiculi and the horns of the gray and the white areas of the spinal cord, they're very specific with the names: posterior, anterior, lateral. So they're telling you where these particular formations are located: front side, back side, or to the side. So just use those directional terms for what they are. But keep in mind that if you're talking about a funiculus, you are in the white matter. If you are talking about a horn, you are in the gray matter. The funiculi are going to be relaying information up and down from the brain, where the gray matter is going to deal with sensory information that's coming into the spinal cord. So they do have specific locations. With the organization of the gray matter, you also have what is called the gray commissure. And the gray commissure is basically a bridge that you have, and it's a very fine bridge. And when we look at the images of the spinal cord, you'll see how small it actually is, but it's a bridge that's going to connect the gray matter on the left side of the spinal cord to the gray matter on the right side of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, I already got into the white matter, so if you flip over to the following page, you have the images of the spinal cord, and you can see those structures that we were talking about. I wish they would give you a full, whole, completed spinal cord so that you could see it all linked together, but you can still get a pretty good view. Again, you see the dorsal root ganglia coming into the backside of your spinal cord. It leads directly into that gray matter, which would make sense because what is it bringing in? It's bringing in sensory information, and it directs it right to the spinal cord, to the gray matter, which processes sensory information. Then you can see where you have the posterior gray horn, the lateral gray horn, and the anterior gray horn, just indicating if you are in the back, the middle, or the front. Then it shows you also where you have, if you look at the last slide on the top, it shows you the posterior median sulcus. You'll notice that it's not quite as deep as the anterior median fissure that you have. But if you look at those two indentations, the sulcus and the fissure, it almost severs and cuts the spinal cord in two. You'll also notice right in that middle location, you have the central canal. This is going to be a region where the cerebral spinal fluid would run through the core of the spinal cord, running up and down from the brain. And then you have the gray commissure, which is that bridge that's going to link the two sides of the gray matter together. The top two pictures that you have there, those are computer generated, and then you have the bottom, which is an actual spinal cord. So that's a cross section that you would see of a true spinal cord itself. The central canal, which is the last slide on that page, I already mentioned. This is going to be for the movement of your cerebral spinal fluid. You also are going to have both sensory and motor nuclei located in that region as well. Sensory is just telling you that it's dealing with sight, smell, hearing, things of that nature. Motor nuclei is telling you that this is actually going to carry out some movement or some action within the body. All right, moving on to the next slide. Next slide starts to get into the spinal nerves. It wraps up the last part of the information on the spinal nerve, gives you a quick summary. Just keep in mind that you do have 31 pairs of spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord itself. The spinal cord is going to be segmented into your cervical, thoracic, and lumbar regions like we saw with the vertebrae themselves. And that different parts of your spinal cord are going to process different information. So sensory information is going to be dealt with on the dorsal side and the gray matter. And then the front side, the anterior roots, is going to take care of the motor responses that your nervous system came up with. Okay. You also have the meningeal layers that are going to help protect the brain and the spinal cord, keep the cerebral spinal fluid in close proximity to it, and make sure that everything as far as nutrients and ion concentrations are what they need to be in and around the brain and spinal cord. The bottom of the page gets into spinal nerves and what are called plexus. This is going to be, and if you look at the definition of a nerve plexus, it's where you have a network of nerve fibers that are going to essentially work together to perform a common function. And it gives you the four major plexus that you have within the body. You have a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, a lumbar, and a sacral plexus. And hopefully those terms, when you see that cervical, hopefully you're thinking neck. Brachial, you're in the arm region. Lumbar, you are in the lower back. And sacral is going to be that triangular plate that is located between your two hip bones. And if you move over to the next page is going to talk about the cervical plexus a little bit, and then we get into the reflexes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video at this point in time. We'll take care of the rest of the information of chapter 13 on Friday, and then we will be getting into chapter 14 as well. So I will see you on